So I know that this is coming like 4 years too late, but until recently, I was a jazz musician who had never seen the movie Whiplash. So in order to rectify this, I watched the movie for the very first time in one of the jazziest places that I know of in New York City,
Washington Square Park.
Since up until now it's the only portrayal of jazz education and popular culture, I get asked all the time if my experience at jazz school mirrors that of the experiences portrayed in Whiplash. And after watching the movie, which is brilliantly acted and shot and directed, I can safely say that no. The small, somewhat insular, and idiosyncratic world of jazz and higher education does not look the way that it does in the film, although it certainly looks like it could be that way. J.K. Simmons plays Terrence Fletcher, the tyrannical band leader at the fictional New York City jazz school, the Schaefer Conservatory. His abuse of a young jazz drummer who is hungering for greatness, Andrew Neiman, played by Miles Teller, looks real, or at least it feels real because of the amazing acting, but there are some things which feel slightly off. Buckle in for an incredibly pedantic review coming from yours truly, an academically trained jazz musician. Let's start with the things that the film got right. Part 1, what the movie got right. So there's a degree of verisimilitude here because of the people working on this project. Miles Teller, in fact, is actually a pretty competent drummer. The script is somewhat autobiographical. Writer-director Damien Chazelle played drums in a competitive high school jazz ensemble with a very strict band director, so the script gets some oddly specific things right, like the lingo that some band directors use. This includes the lower tiers band director saying, "Put some sugar on that," as he's rehearsing the reeds.
Bottom, yeah. Put some sugar on it.
Meaning that he wants some more swagger in the articulation. Or Fletcher saying, 2 bars for free.
2 bars for free.
Meaning that he'll count off 2 measures before the band's entrance. These sorts of things can only come from playing in a jazz band. Even little things like the way that Fletcher refers to trombones as bones in a staccato inflection.
Bones.
That certainly sounds right to me. Other little things like Fletcher getting really upset at people leaving their folders around.
If I ever find one of these lying around again, I swear to God, I will stop being so polite.
Is a very real thing. This will send all band directors into a fit of rage because sheet music is expensive and nobody wants to pay for students' carelessness. The building of the fictional Schaefer Conservatory looks old and crummy. They certainly nailed the look. That's how my alma mater, Manhattan School of Music, kind of looks. The scene where Andrew's extended family doesn't really get Andrew's obsession for music, as well as his accomplishments, definitely rings true for a lot of musicians. I actually felt that that scene was the most emotionally accurate portrayal of anything in the entire film. Fletcher has a certain way of sauntering in front of the band, which actually reminds me a lot of my band directors in college. The general posture of J.K. Simmons and Miles Teller more or less looks right.
The way they have their shoulders, they're like there is kind of like a slant. You know, it's a certain posture and a certain way they kind of sit over the kit.
I could sit here all day and nitpick all of the times that Miles Teller is moving his hands a certain way and what we're seeing is not what we're hearing, but honestly, it's not that important, and they got it more or less right, because the entire band is made up of professional musicians, and they're miming too, but at least they're holding their instruments correctly and more or less fingering what we're hearing. That is, everybody in the band except for the people with speaking roles, and I think I know why that might be, because in order to have a speaking role in a Hollywood movie, you need to be a member of the Screen Actors Guild, and it's going to be the actors, not the musicians, who actually bother getting a union card. So if the people in the movie have lines,
What are you doing?
chances are they're not going to look like they're playing their instrument for real. Oh, that's unfortunate. But anyway, that's not super important. It doesn't affect how the world of jazz is portrayed, and there's still other really oddly specific details that the movie got right, like handwriting in the various subdivisions of 7/4 on the drum chart for the titular piece, Whiplash. Whiplash, written by Hank Levy for the Don Ellis Orchestra, is in 7/4, 7 beats per measure, but at a certain point, it's felt in shifting subdivisions of 2 and 3/8 notes that don't really repeat. The feel of 7/4 changes rapidly, so the extra markings are important in understanding how to play it. Fun aside, I recently discovered the shorthand that some drummers use for groupings of 2 and 3/8 notes. They represent groupings of 2/8 notes as a line and 3/8 notes as a triangle. This has nothing to do with the movie Whiplash. I just thought that was interesting. Anyway, nobody would know this fine detail of musicianship unless you actually had to play the piece of music, like writer-director Damien Chazelle did when he was in high school.
Some of the pieces of the music in the movie were pieces that I played myself as a drummer, Whiplash, Caravan, so those were kind of starting points in a way.
What starts to take me out of the movie, though, are the little details that the movie just kind of gets wrong. Part 2, what the movie got mildly wrong. The whole movie feels like Damien Chazelle is remembering the general gist of jazz culture, but only through the haze of the memory of his experiences in high school. Like, for example, this guy. This guy does not look like a jazz musician. He looks like a high school jock. There is this guy, however. He does look like a jazz musician. He's decked out in jazz normcore attire, but he's wearing a bass backpack case. In New York City, nobody wears those. Everybody uses wheels because they're a lot easier to navigate the New York City subway as well as the tight quarters of buildings. And there's also the odd use of lingo, which feels off somehow, like it's been translated in Google like one too many times. For example, when Fletcher invites Andrew to play at JVC, Fletcher assures him that they'll be playing songs that Andrew knows from the, quote, studio band playlist.
I'm using the studio band playlist.
Any musician would call this the studio band set list. Playlists are for Spotify. When the drum folder gets misplaced, Tanner says, I don't know the charts by heart.
Don't know the charts by heart. You know Whiplash by heart.
He wouldn't say that. He would say, I don't have the charts memorized. During Fletcher's first abusive tirade towards Andrew, he demands that Andrew count me at 215, as in count at 215 beats per minute.
Count me at 215.
That doesn't really happen or make sense. Steady timekeeping is much more valued, as in the ability to follow a count off and keep the tempo steady throughout an entire piece of music. And funnily enough, when Andrew counts, it's actually fairly close to 215 beats per minute.
Count me at 215.
1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Jesus fucking Christ!
Fletcher then says,
Am I to understand that you cannot read tempo?
any trained musician who's asked to do that, count off a specific BPM marking without a reference or without a count off, will just ballpark it, because honestly, it's just not that important of a skill to have. Fletcher then talks a little bit too literally about quarter note equals 330 and says,
That is a double time swing.
that, I don't know, technically makes sense because double time swing sometimes is used as a shorthand for fast swing feel, although technically that's not really what it means.
Double time swing.
It's J.K. Simmons' delivery of the line,
His double time swing.
Here a little double time swing. No, double time.
as well as the insistent use of that phrase throughout the entire movie, which feels kind of off. Then when Fletcher is menacing the band, he keeps referencing a, quote, out-of-tune player.
An out-of-tune player here.
The phrase would be probably somebody is playing out of tune. Then, of course, there's this chestnut.
Hey, Dad, look at my paradiddle.
And then the kid doesn't play the rudiment of a paradiddle. Of course, that is also because kids are kind of stupid, but, you know, there is that. But personally, the most jarring of all these little minor grievances is when Fletcher reminds the brass to, quote, sharp the ninth.
Brass, do not forget we sharp that ninth.
Which makes no sense. You would say that to a chord player, like a guitarist or a pianist, who consistently forgets to voice the 9 as a sharp 9 on, say, a dominant 7th chord. You wouldn't say that to an entire section. If you want to remind one person to change the note from, say, a D natural concert on a C7 to a D sharp, you'd single out that particular player. And for a character like Terrence Fletcher, singling out a particular player for humiliation seems like it's part of his character. So why they didn't do that and just said, brass sharp the 9th, anyway, all of these moments have the cumulative effect of, say, an American actor speaking in kind of a bad British accent.
Far from my heart that burns with passion.
They're all kind of unintentionally funny. It's made more frustrating by the fact that the movie got a lot of things almost right. Part 3, what the movie got, like, almost right. Okay, so there are little things which are technically true, but a little strange, especially considering that I think they were added just to make it feel more realistic. Like, for example, Tanner telling Andrew to tune the drum set to B flat.
Tune the set to B flat.
This is a super old school technique that was only really used when bands were playing in very horn-friendly keys like B flat, but for the more modern repertoire, like the tune Whiplash, for example, the practical effect of tuning the resonant elements of a drum set to a particular key is minimal, if not useless.
Excuse me, can I get a B flat?
Fletcher then claps in fast tempos on beats 1 and 3.
Double time swing. Faster!
This is actually not quite as cringy as it might seem, even though it's fairly cringy to clap on 1 and 3, because jazz big band conductors will conduct fast tempos on beats 1 and 3, as in 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Except when you're counting off something, you're going to snap on beats 2 and 4, as in 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. They'll also pronounce the word 1 as un. Fun fact. And then, it's not really wrong, but there's the issue of how Fletcher counts off the tune Whiplash.
5, 6, and.
Even if Damien Chazelle thinks this is right, this sounds kind of wrong to me, admittedly for some fairly subtle reasons. You see, dancers think in 8 counts, so choreographers' starting routines will start on 5, as in 5, 6, 7, 8, whereas musicians starting in 4/4 will always start in 1, 1, 2, 3, 4. So any musician who has ever worked with a dancer, hearing a 5 at the beginning of a count-off will immediately cringe.
5, 6, 7, 5, 6, 7.
But Whiplash is not in 4/4, it's in 7/4. There are 7 beats to the measure, so if you're going to start the count off on beat 1, it would take forever to get to the point where you're actually supposed to start playing. So Fletcher starts counting on 5 and counts the final 3 beats of a measure of 7/4 as the count off.
5, 6, and 5, 6, and.
Chazelle probably remembered his old band director doing it this way, so he had Fletcher start the count off on 5, the thing that makes my skin kind of crawl.
5, 6, and.
The thing is that's a fairly old school way of counting off odd time signatures, and it's not really used that much anymore.
5, 6, and.
The problem is that this method sometimes leads to some confusion,
Wait for my cue.
especially in a chart like Whiplash, where the 7/4 is subdivided in different places in the chart. So with some exceptions, modern practice suggests that you count off everything in 4/4, no matter the time signature, just to avoid that kind of confusion. That confusion actually exists in the movie during the abusive rushing, dragging scene, where Andrew gets confused and is counting in 7 briefly, but Fletcher then insists that he counts in 4.
Start counting.
5, 6,
In
7.
4, damn it! Look at me!
Anyway, none of this so far, none of it really affects anything. It doesn't affect the plot in any sort of meaningful way. It's all just kind of been, like astrophysicists complaining about Interstellar or whatever. Most of us really just don't care. We just want to enjoy the movie on its own storytelling merit. I apologize for what has effectively been the jazz equivalent of Neil deGrasse Tyson complaining about every science fiction movie ever. So let's move beyond the surface level. Let's talk about the character of Terrence Fletcher. Are the tough love elements in Terrence Fletcher's teaching really there in modern jazz conservatories? Part 4, Terrence Fletcher. Terrence Fletcher is a professor who teaches at a prestigious New York City jazz school. So I talked to a professor who teaches at a prestigious New York City jazz school, my good friend Josh Bailey, who teaches at NYU Steinhardt, and asked him what would happen if somebody like Terrence Fletcher actually taught young students today.
They're freshmen and confused and torn in 1,000 different directions. So if I were to whiplash them, because that's a verb now, you can whiplash. If I were to whiplash them, then they would be like, well, I'm going to not do this as my major and just switch to poli-sci because I can. I've sort of learned that, at least with this generation, or maybe the last 2 or 3 years of students, to have a tough love mentality, but from a removed perspective, and I don't actually implement it upon them. I'll tell them my tough love stories that I had, so that way they can avoid it.
Terrence Fletcher is a useful storytelling trope. The abusive mentor who will stop at absolutely nothing from drawing greatness from his students.
I will never apologize for how I tried.
Fletcher's justification of his negative reinforcement comes from a story that he likes to tell of an incident that happened at the Reno Club in Kansas City when Charlie Parker sat in on a jam session and played quite poorly. House drummer Joe Jones was not impressed with Charlie Parker's playing, and so he threw a cymbal, according to the movie, at Charlie Parker, nearly decapitating him, which inspired Charlie Parker to go home and practice and become one of the greats. Now, this story, as it's told by the movie, is very much embellished. Joe Jones just kind of dropped the cymbal on the ground as kind of like a gong, vibing Charlie Parker, telling him that he was no good for the session and he should come back later when he was ready.
I told you that story about how Charlie Parker became Charlie Parker, right?
Joe Jones threw a cymbal at his head.
This mischaracterization of the incident is kind of like the character of Fletcher himself. Maybe based on a real thing, but amped up to this grotesque level for the purpose of storytelling.
It's a tough world, and there are a lot of guys out there that are not unlike Terrence Fletcher.
Professors who do some of the things that Fletcher does do exist. I mean, maybe not the level of abuse, but things like the casual misogyny,
Well, you're in the first chair. Let's see if it's just because you're cute.
the homophobic insults,
This is not a Bette Midler concert. We will not be serving cosmopolitans in baked Alaska, so just play faster than you give f***ing hand jobs, will you please?
singling out players for unnecessary levels of humiliation. Yeah, those things do unfortunately happen, especially from professors cut from the cloth of the, quote, old school. Fletcher's obsession with the story of Charlie Parker does also kind of ring true, because older professors ensconced in the ivory tower often don't know of any jazz past 1960. Chances are Damien Chazelle isn't hip to these musicians either, but the characterization of the older musician who doesn't know anything about anything new is accurate, so there's that. Chazelle probably has no idea who young musicians might idolize. Yeah, Charlie Parker is deeply respected, but there is kind of the elephant in the room when it comes to talking about the movie Whiplash and young musicians' fixations on particular musicians. And that elephant is Part 5, Buddy Rich. The movie's choice to have Andrew obsess over Buddy Rich is, I guess, narratively a good one. Buddy Rich was a jazz big band drummer that to this day is a household name because of his flashy chops. He also was a band leader cut from a very similar cloth as Terrence Fletcher.
Well, you just gotta listen to the greats then. Buddy Rich.
Buddy demanded perfection from his band and would get angry and abusive if he felt like the band was not stepping up. There are an infamous series of recordings known as the bus tapes of Buddy Rich excoriating his band that sound quite similar to Terrence Fletcher's tirades.
If I hear one clam from anybody, you've had it. One clam and this whole band is through tonight. Try me.
When I was at Berkeley in Boston, I studied jazz composition underneath the great Greg Hopkins, who played trumpet and arranged for Buddy Rich's band for several years.
This is Greg Hopkins from a recent appearance on the cross.
Greg had a ton of respect for Buddy Rich, but admitted that he could be a bit of a monster sometimes, somebody to be feared on the bandstand as much as respected. So for Andrew to obsess over Buddy Rich, that just makes perfect movie sense. By seeking to emulate Buddy Rich, Andrew seeks to curry favor with the other tyrannical band leader, Terrence Fletcher.
Greg Hopkins.
That just kind of makes sense from a storytelling perspective, but from the perspective of a young jazz musician studying jazz in New York City in the modern era, the idolization of Buddy Rich just makes absolutely no sense. Buddy Rich became a household name largely because of his association with show business. He was a frequent guest on Johnny Carson, so the general public is likely to know who he is. But as far as musicians go, his influence on modern jazz is quite minimal.
What are some drummers that a lot of students are checking out?
Nate Smith, for sure. Ari Honig seems to be a name that comes up a lot. Mark Juliana, 100%.
All guys who are living right now.
All guys who are living.
How Buddy Rich developed this sort of popular cult of personality is quite interesting, and Ethan Iverson goes into great detail on the subject in a really illuminating blog post on Whiplash. You should definitely check it out if you have the time. Iverson notes that on Rolling Stone's list of the 100 greatest drummers of all time, white jazz big band drummers Gene Krupa and Buddy Rich place significantly higher on the list than black small jazz ensemble drummers Tony Williams and Elvin Jones, despite the fact that Tony Williams and Elvin Jones are indisputably better drummers with more of an influence on jazz and are far more respected as artists among jazz musicians, especially in jazz conservatories. Not the drumming of Buddy Rich, especially in a city like New York.
My undergrad was like state school, not in New York City. So like when you're talking about big band, like every semester someone references Buddy Rich. I don't hear that at all in New York. Like I don't hear Buddy Rich being referenced, which is maybe a good thing in my opinion. But, you know, yeah, everyone's living who these kids like. Because I start every class, I'll ask them, like, what music are you checking out? And most of it is, like, hip-hop fusion with jazz.
There is a healthy study of bebop and hard bop, but really it's hip-hop and, to a lesser cultural extent, electronic music, which are driving the tastes of young jazz musicians studying jazz in New York City today. Granted, Andrew Neiman busting out the Dilla beats in Terrence Fletcher's big band probably wouldn't make any sort of sense, so I understand the need for some stylistic cohesion here. Which brings me to the issue of the movie's soundtrack. Part 6, the soundtrack. Okay, so the jazz big band on this recording that plays charts like Whiplash sounds okay, kind of sloppy at times, but I do know that this was a film with a limited budget, so they couldn't hire, like, say, the Metropole Orchestra to record it. And it's supposed to be a student band anyway, so I guess it actually kind of works. If this is the movie that gets people exposed to modern jazz big band music, I'm okay with it, especially with the dramatic use of the chart Caravan in the final scene. What doesn't work for me is the rest of the soundtrack, composed by Justin Hurwitz. It's supposed to be jazz, but honestly, it fails on every single account, especially in the scene where Andrew happens upon Fletcher playing piano in a supposed jazz club in New York City. The music that Fletcher plays is easily the most milquetoast, boring, and flat jazz you could possibly imagine. Jamie Aebersold backing tracks have much more life and energy to them than what we hear in the movie. It is mediocrity defined. If Joe Jones was there, he definitely would have dropped the cymbal. It is a parody of the Starbucks jazz that Fletcher supposedly dislikes.
Every Starbucks jazz album just proves my point, really.
Put it simply, this is not what you would hear in a New York City jazz club. In the movie, it looks like the fictional club that Andrew walks into is somewhere in the West Village. This is closer to what you would hear in the West Village. I recorded this at Robert Glasper's residency at the Blue Note back in October. It includes all of the tropes of modern New York City jazz, including fast fusion noodlings, followed by a cheeky quote, in this case, Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition. And then, yep, Dilla Jazz. In fact, played by the progenitor of the entire style himself, Chris Daddy Dave. The hip-hop infused jazz is everywhere. That's a big part of the culture in New York City right now, and that's not what we got in the movie. We got the Little Tykes version of jazz. This scene made me more annoyed than I thought I would be going into the movie. At least in the show like Mozart in the Jungle, which shows the life of contemporary classical musicians, they have relevant modern composers like Thomas Otis featured in musical scenes that at least have some relevance to modern classical music. So why couldn't they do the same thing for jazz? I read an interview with the composer Justin Hurwitz to try and figure out why he did what he did. Hurwitz plays the piano, yet his education was mostly classical without much of a jazz background. Yet Hurwitz has gotten an intensive jazz program working on Chazelle's last two films. Damien put me on a steady diet of jazz, both American and French music scores, he says. Ethan Iverson's blog post replies to this suitably incredulously. This is where I get jealous of hip-hop. Hip-hop has guarded its black sovereignty so well. Imagine if, for a movie about hip-hop, the composer said he was new to this style, so he studied Eminem and Iggy Azalea, not to mention the founding father of French spoken word and sexy style, Serge Gainsbourg. It's at this point in the club that we see that the movie is not about music. The movie has very little love for the art of jazz. Instead, it's all about competition and perfectionism and sweat and blood and overcoming the obstacles. This is a sports movie. Part 7. This is a sports movie. There is a hierarchy in Terrence Fletcher's studio band. Andrew Neiman starts as an alternate drummer and then rises to the rank of core drummer. This kind of is somewhat reminiscent of the idea of first and second string quarterbacks.
Oh, what happened? Drive got named this year's MVP.
That's fantastic, Travis.
The concepts of alternates and cores does not exist in collegiate and professional jazz ensembles. Only the total number of people necessary to play the music will be there. You certainly would not have a backup sitting there on stage in a performance, ready to take over at a moment's notice, like somebody waiting their turn on the bench. There's a similar hierarchy hinted at when Fletcher talks about things like first, second, or third trumpet.
And when he graduated, Marsalis made him third trumpet at Lincoln Center. A year later, he was first.
Ugh, this isn't right at all. The roles of all the horn players are specialized, so a first trumpet player will specialize in high notes, and a fourth trumpet player might specialize in playing the flugelhorn, and a second trumpet player might specialize in soloing. This is how it works in the real world, but the concept of chairs is used by the movie Whiplash to emphasize the theme of competition.
Jackson, congratulations, you're fourth chair. Metz, why are you still sitting there? Get the f*** out!
And there's a lot of competition happening, not only among the students, but it also seems like the jazz band is entering a lot of competitions. Fletcher says,
everybody remember, Lincoln Center and its ilk use these competitions to decide who they're interested in and who they're not.
It's like they're athletic talent scouts, searching the collegiate circuit for new blood, like for the NCAA or whatever.
The Schaefer Conservatory Studio Band.
That's not how it works. New York City collegiate jazz ensembles don't enter competitions all the time. They gig. They play concerts. In fact, they sometimes play concerts as featured artists at Lincoln Center. What made me truly think that this movie is a sports movie, and kind of a mean-spirited one at that, are the ridiculous practice scenes. Not only the ones where Andrew is playing, I guess, so much and so fast his hands start to bleed, and he punches through his snare drum, but also the round robin scene where Fletcher verbally abuses his three drummers into playing faster, I guess? Is that what people think practicing is? Is this what people think jazz school is? I know the point in these scenes is to show the physical nature of music.
I did want this movie to kind of flirt with the ideas of physical violence and the sort of physical toll.
But if you're hurting yourself while you're practicing, you're not gonna get any better. Bottom line, practice in itself is a slow and deliberate thing. It can be meditative, but it can also be super boring to watch. Just watch my 5-hour practice routine video. That's a lot closer to what actual practice at an actual conservatory actually is. No violence, no physical abuse, just a lot of work.
How long was I going for? I was going for 5 hours. Yeah.
This gets me to my final point, which matters the most for me personally, and I think the thing that the movie Whiplash gets the most wrong about young people studying music today. Part 8. Music is, like, fun. The great jazz drummer Peter Erskine wrote a review of the movie Whiplash that includes a quote that I think is most relevant to what I want to say on this matter. I'm disappointed that any viewer of the film will not see the joy of music making that's almost always a part of large ensemble rehearsals and performances. Musicians make music because they love music. None of that is really apparent in the film, in my opinion.
I hear so many great young musicians playing this music, and they play the music because they love the music.
I can see the joy of music happening a little bit in the scene where Andrew is watching Buddy Rich play on his phone while Andrew's on the bus. This sort of thing happens a lot. Young jazz musicians will excitedly check out musicians that they like on YouTube or wherever. I cannot tell you how many times I've been in this situation.
Dude, you gotta check out this video. It's Rajesh Mahanthapa playing with Vijay Iyer at the Jazz Standard. Oh, it's so killing. Oh, dude, after this we gotta check out Steve Lehman. Oh, this will blow your mind. Dude, that album that he did with Damien Reed, oh my God, oh, so good.
That scene doesn't happen in the movie Whiplash because in the movie Whiplash, nobody really seems to care about music. No student turns to another student and says, have you checked out this drummer? Or, hey man, were you at the session at Smalls last night? How was it? Nobody even quotes the lick at one another, which, you know, personally, I'm deeply offended by. All of it is just fear and anger and posturing on the part of Andrew and the student body with none of the motivation behind it, a genuine love of music. There is no community of young jazz musicians who love music and want to share in it.
These guys are developing a community of, like, support for taking a risk. They're, like, supporting each other as, like, fellow members of the trenches. You know, they're in the ditches together.
Camaraderie and love of music are not apparent at all in the movie Whiplash, which is fine because it wants to tell a different story. Just know that jazz culture as it appears in the movie Whiplash is off a little bit. This is not a meticulously researched period piece like, say, Downton Abbey is. The jazz culture and the setting of New York City are merely ancillary to the plot and the characters of the story. It's decoration. It's all kind of detritus from the memory of a young director that's been reappropriated for telling a specific sort of story.
You know, a memory that's always been very present in my mind. And it just occurred to me, you know, a few years ago that maybe it could actually make a movie.
Jazz, for Damien Chazelle, seems to be almost an emotional reaction to his experiences from high school, rather than something that he genuinely enjoys doing. And narratively, yeah, I get it. I understand why certain choices were made. But remember, Whiplash is the only portrayal of jazz education in popular culture. It's the only one. At least Neil deGrasse Tyson has thousands and thousands of sci-fi movies to pick apart. So I think that it's important to pick out fact from fiction in a piece of media like this when it's dealing with a specific culture. To be fair, I very much enjoyed the movie on its own merits. I just wanted to share my 2 cents on the matter for whatever they're worth. Whiplash, for me, was a great movie with excellent direction, just tight, exciting, amazing, but it got jazz kind of wrong.